This is Monica with Cross to Cross Conversations, and this is episode 4 of a Black History series titled The Reckoning is Here. There were a couple of things I saw over the past couple of days. While studying for this series, I came across a book that I wanted to read, and I went to look up the book, and while I was looking at the reviews of the book, I came across one comment that said, all of this is lies. Just stop it already. It's all lies." I ordered the book. Then earlier today, I was reading a news article about a black lady who was arrested for murder, and just wanted to read the story because it stated that, she did stay there after the incident happened, and she was explaining her side of the story. And in the comment section, a guy posted and he said, "Oh, the usual suspects. We need to bring back lynching." And so, for those of you who's asking, why am I doing this? That's why. So, I have a heavy content warning for you. This episode is going to discuss slavery, the legal dehumanization of black people. It's going to discuss brutal violence and systemic oppression. If you need to pause, please do. Again, self-care and your mental health is very important. So, over the past 3 episodes, we've spoken about black identity. We've talked about the faith that sustained us through slavery. And we've talked about black excellence that was hidden. Now, today, we're going to talk about the price. The price black people paid and are still paying for America's wealth, America's comfort, and America's refusal to acknowledge that debt. And today we're going to start at the beginning. So we're going to start at 1619. Yes, you heard that accurately. Not 1776, not the Declaration of Independence, not the all men are created equal. We're going to start at 1619 because that's when America's original sin began. And we're going to trace that sin from 1619 all the way to 1877. So from the first enslaved Africans to the end of the Reconstruction period. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the system was designed this way. And you'll understand why it's never really been dismantled. And you also understand why I say the reckoning is coming. So, August 1619, Jamestown, Virginia. Most Americans are taught that America was founded in 1776. But the truth is, you could say that America was founded in 1619. That's when the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. It was about 20 people kidnapped and brought across the Middle Passage and sold as property. That was America's true founding. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't liberty, it wasn't justice, it was slavery. And everything that came after that, the wealth, the expansion, the power, it was built on slavery. And that's why 1619 matters. Some people will get upset when we say 1619 is America's founding. And they may even say that, we're dividing things. That's like rewriting history. But no, it's telling the truth. Because you can't understand America without understanding that slavery wasn't just some side issue. It was the foundation. The economy was built on it, the laws were designed to protect it, and the Constitution codified it. So I'm sure some of you may have heard of the Three-Fifths Compromise, and that was that enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, giving southern states more political power while denying enslaved people any rights. And briefly, I just want to bring up the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Constitution required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers even from free states. So slavery was written into the founding documents. So when we say 1619, we're saying this is where it started. This is where the seed of destruction was planted. And as you know, seeds grow. So slavery became an institution from 1619 to the Civil War. Slavery spread across the South like cancer. And by 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States. 4 million people that were considered property. And then we're going to jump to the year 1718, New Orleans and Code Noir. So let me tell you about a year you probably didn't learn about in school at all. I know I just recently learned about it. It's been a little over 2 years now. So in 1718, the French founded New Orleans. Within 3 years, by 1721, New Orleans had more enslaved black people than free white people. This wasn't an accident, it was by design. So New Orleans was strategically positioned at the mouth of the Mississippi River. It became the gateway for slavery into the Deep South. And in 1724, the French colonial government enacted one of the most brutal slavery laws in the Americas. And what was that? It was Code Noir. And what was Code Noir? It did several things. First, it made slavery hereditary and permanent. So if your mother was enslaved, you were born enslaved. There was no path to freedom. And so slavery became a permanent race-based status that passed from generation to generation. Second, it enforced racial hierarchy. So it created a legal caste system based on race. It defined who was black and who was white. It made racial subordination the law of the land. Third, it regulated brutal punishment. So the codes specify exactly how enslaved people could be punished, whether it was whipping, branding, or mutilation. And it gave enslavers legal protection for this violence. You couldn't be prosecuted for torturing or even killing your quote unquote property. Fourth, it mandated religion conversion. So all enslaved people had to convert to Catholicism. And religion became a tool of control. It weaponized to enforce obedience and submission. So, in other words, they didn't, like we went over, I think it was in episode 3, the last episode, we talked about how religion became that tool of control. They weaponized scripture in such a way that they made it appear as if God was for slavery, and they took scripture out of context to make sure you submitted to what scripture thus your master was saying. And fifth, it controlled even free black people. So the code didn't just regulate enslaved people, it also restricted free black people. So it decided where they could live, where they could work, where they could travel. So it created a system of surveillance and control that applied to all black people, whether you were enslaved or free. And so New Orleans became the gateway for slavery in the Deep South. Enslaved people were brought from Africa to the Caribbean through New Orleans, then sold throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and beyond. And the Mississippi River became a highway for human trafficking. So that code Noir, I think I'm saying it right, Noir, it became a model. And so other southern states looked at Louisiana's code and created similar laws, like South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi. The legal framework spread across the South. So 1718 is the year slavery infrastructure expanded westward. So from Virginia in 1619, and then the Carolinas, and then into Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley. So 1718, New Orleans, Code Noir, all of that. It's important. So slavery, you must understand, it wasn't just about racism. It was about money. Remember back then, cotton was king. Tobacco, rice, sugarcane. The South's entire economy depended on that. What do you want to call free labor? In the North, the North wasn't totally innocent in this, right? Some northern banks financed the slave trade. Textile mills processed the southern cotton. Insurance companies insured enslaved people as property. So they were insured as property. And then some northern merchants grew wealthy from the slave economy. So the entire American economy was built on slavery. And as slavery grew, so did the laws protecting it. So you had slave codes controlled every aspect of enslaved people's lives. They had no right to marry. They had no right to own property. They couldn't learn to read or write. They had no right to testify in court against a white person, no right to self defense, no legal protections from sexual abuse, torture, or murder. Again, we spoke about this. Enslaved people were property, they weren't considered people. And the legal system made sure it stayed that way. But the resistance never stopped. Even in the midst of this horror, black people often resisted. So in 1831 was Nat Turner's Rebellion. It was an armed uprising in Virginia. It was about 55 to 65 white people killed before it was brutally suppressed, and Turner and his followers were executed. Laws became even harsher after Nat Turner's rebellion. I'm sure most of you have heard about the Underground Railroad. Thousands escaped to freedom through a network of safe houses and routes. And as you know, Harriet Tubman made quite a few missions freeing approximately 70 people. Now, I've heard that she's gone back anywhere between 13 through 19 times. It depends on which resource you're using. But I noticed that there was some discrepancy between multiple sources, and it was anywhere between 13 and 19 missions. I don't think that is as important as the fact that she actually was the one going back and forth, getting these people and getting them to these safe houses. There was daily resistance. There was work slowdowns, tool breaking. Some slaves even ran away. You know, there was a they tried to preserve their culture and faith despite the many attempts to destroy what they had. And so black people never accepted slavery. They fought it every day. But the system was designed to crush resistance, which going to bring us to, we're going to jump forward to 1857. So in 1857, I know you've heard of the Dred Scott versus Sandford decision. Dred Scott was an enslaved man in Missouri. His enslaver name was John Emerson, who was a doctor, and he took him to Illinois. And Illinois was a free state, and Wisconsin territory, where slavery was prohibited by the Missouri Compromise. So this doctor took Dred Scott and his family, moved them to Illinois and even within the Wisconsin territory, and both of those were considered free states. So Scott lived in free territory for years. But when Dr. Emerson died, Scott sued for his freedom, and his argument was, I lived in free states, so I should be free. You would think that would be a reasonable argument based on the legal precedents. Several enslaved people had won their freedom this way before because they were living in free states, then they've gained their freedom. But the Supreme Court had other plans. So the Supreme Court decision came down March 6, 1857, and Chief Justice Robert B. Taney, not quite sure how to pronounce it, he delivered the opinion, and it was one of the most evil rulings in history. And here's what he said. So part of in his ruling, part of what he said was that black people, whether enslaved or free, are not and cannot be citizens of the United States. He said they are beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. They had no rights with which the white man was bound to respect. Read that again. He said they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So what does that mean? It meant that Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, they ruled that black people were not citizens. So even free black people had no constitutional rights. Black people who had never been enslaved had no constitutional rights. And even black people who owned property, paid taxes, and contributed to society, they had no rights. They were not citizens. So, part two, the second thing that it meant was that enslaved people were property. They could be taken anywhere, even into free states, and they remained property. A white person could travel to a free state with their property, and the free state couldn't do anything about it. The third thing it did was Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territory. So that meant slavery could expand westward not without any limits. Every new state could be a slave state. And then it also, the fourth thing it did was it declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. And so the law that had kept a balance between free and slave states for decades was now thrown out. And so the decision made slavery permanent and national. It said slavery could never be abolished through legal means. The only way to end slavery would be through war. And so that's why that case matters. I want you to understand that power dynamic. So in 1857, John Sandford owned Dred Scott. Sandford was a white man. He had complete legal power over Scott, who was a black man. Scott was property, and Sandford was the owner of said property. Scott had no rights, and Sandford had all of the rights. And that was the law of the land back in 1857. And the Supreme Court said that's how it should stay forever. So that decision, the Dred Scott decision, outraged abolitionists and free state residents. It pushed the nation closer to a civil war. And Frederick Douglass said the decision was a shocking display of depravity, but predicted it will ultimately galvanize the anti-slavery movement. And as you know, he was right. 4 years later, the Civil War began. And so let's be very clear. The Civil War was really about slavery. It wasn't really about states' rights, economic differences, northern aggression. Regardless of what they teach you, it was in essence about slavery. I'm going to read some of the Confederate States' Declaration of Secession, what they say explicitly. So, South Carolina's declaration. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of man to the high office of President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Mississippi's declaration was, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia's declaration, the people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. So they told us exactly why they were fighting, and we should believe them. Those three actually mentioned slavery in each of their declarations, so they said why they were fighting. So let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, midway through the war. That was when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. But it didn't free everyone. It didn't apply to the border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri. Those border states are the ones that remained in the Union. It didn't apply to parts of the Confederacy already under Union control. It only applied to areas still in rebellion, which the Union didn't control yet. So initially, it didn't free anyone immediately, but it did do three things. It made the war about ending slavery. The Union was now fighting to abolish slavery, not just to preserve the Union. They were fighting to abolish slavery. I was just reading that to you. And this prevented European powers from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. Two, the other thing it did was it allowed black men to join the Union Army. So nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors fought for the Union. They were essential to victory. Many of them were formerly enslaved people fighting for their own freedom and their families' freedom. It made clear that slavery would end if the Union won. There would be no compromise, no returning to the status quo. Slavery would be abolished, and the Union did win. So April 9th of 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered. So the Civil War was over at that time, but the fight for freedom was pretty much still just beginning. Now we're going to move to December 6, 1865, and that was when the 13th Amendment was ratified. Most people know it as the amendment that abolished slavery, but I want you to read the actual text carefully. So the text says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime whereof the party should have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Did you catch that? It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But there was an exception there. There was a clause. It said except as punishment for crime, and that was the loophole. So you could look at that as the exception clause. Slavery didn't end, it just transformed. So southern states immediately began passing black codes, which were laws designed to criminalize black life, if you will, and funnel black people into the criminal justice system. So you had vagrancy laws, like if you were unemployed, you could be arrested and forced into labor. Apprenticeship laws. Black children could be taken from their parents and forced into unpaid apprenticeships. So basically slavery by another name, because if it's an apprenticeship, you're getting paid, but in this case it's forced and unpaid, so it's slavery. Loitering laws. If you were just standing on the street corner, you could get arrested. Insulting gesture laws, showing disrespect to a white person could get you arrested. So once arrested, the black people were convicted by all white juries and sentenced to hard labor. Then they were leased to plantations, mines, railroads, factories. They were leased to these people, and they were forced to do the exact same work that they'd done under slavery. This is what was called convict leasing. So it was basically a slavery by another name. And under the 13th Amendment, it was legal. The amendment that supposedly freed black people actually created a new system to re-enslave them. So we'll talk about more about that probably in the next episode. That's how I had it outlined for the next episode. I'll bring it up a little bit more there. But I want you to understand this. The 13th Amendment didn't end slavery. It redefined it. Again, because of that exception clause. So, for a brief moment, in just a brief moment, for about approximately 12 years, there was some hope. Reconstruction was the period when the federal government tried to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society as free citizens. And the black people, they seized this opportunity. There was black political power. For the first time in American history, black men could vote. And it did. 16 black men were elected to Congress during the Reconstruction. Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. senator in 1870, Mississippi. Blanche Bruce became the first black person to serve a full Senate term, also representing Mississippi. And over 2,000 black men were elected to local and state offices across the South. So you had black politicians, black sheriffs, black judges, black legislators. So they were in real political power. And that may have terrified some of the white Southerners, right? They even saw economic progress during this period of Reconstruction. So, black families bought land. In some areas, black people accumulated significant property. So, they had farms, businesses, homes. The black communities built over 4,000 schools for black children. And then there was something that was created called the Freedmen's Bureau. And what the Freedmen's Bureau did, it provided food, medical care, education, and legal assistance to formerly enslaved people. Black literacy rates soared. In 1860, approximately 10% of black people could read. But by 1880, it jumped to nearly 30%. So in one generation, black people went from being legally prohibited from learning to read to creating an entire educational infrastructure. So you can see there that black people were building. But then the 14th Amendment came in 1868, which also granted citizenship to all people born in the US, including formerly enslaved people. So this pretty much overturned the Dred Scott decision and guaranteed equal protection under the law. So that was its purpose, to overturn the Dred Scott decision. So black people were citizens now, they had rights. And then the 15th Amendment came down in 1870, and it prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So basically, black men could vote, and they voted in huge numbers. This was democracy. But of course, there was some resistance to them. White Southerners could not accept this progress, this Reconstruction, and they formed terrorist organizations. For instance, they had the Ku Klux Klan, they had White League, they had Red Shirts. They used violence, intimidation, murder to suppress black voting and destroy black political power. So these terrorist organizations was against the Reconstruction. They were against seeing what the black people were accomplishing. And in order to resist this from going forward, they would use violence and intimidation. So they would lynch black politicians. They burned black schools. They terrorized black communities, and they massacred black people who even tried to vote. And the federal government started to lose its will to fight. So in the North, see, a lot of people like to say that slavery wasn't in the North, and I think I have an outline to begin to discuss that a little bit more in a future episode. But they grew tired of Reconstruction, so Northern whites didn't want to keep sending troops to the South. So all of that political will and desire to protect black rights, that was fading away. And so there in 1876, there was an election, a presidential election between Rutherford Hayes, who was a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat. And the election was disputed in several southern states. Both sides claimed victory. So the nation was on the brink of another crisis because of this. So political leaders, they entered into a deal, and the deal ended the Reconstruction that was going on. So all of that hope, all of that promise that they had, all of the building that the black people were doing, and the support that they were receiving for it, The deal that they made ended the Reconstruction, and that deal was called the Compromise of 1877. And what that compromise stated was that Hayes will become president, so you had a Republican president, and in exchange, all federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. So federal oversight would end, and the federal protection of black civil rights would also end. And so that is what brought the end to that Reconstruction period. So without federal protection, black people in the South were left to the mercy of white supremacists. And as you know, if you know your history, there was no mercy. So that was what you want to call betrayal to the highest order. Black people had fought for the Union. Black soldiers risked their lives. Black people had voted. They served in office. They built schools and communities. They'd done everything that they were supposed to do. They participated in democracy. They believed in America's promises, and the federal government abandoned them. And so those 12 years of the Reconstruction period basically was gone. And so there's something else that white Southerners called this period, that after the compromise of 1877, and basically that period ended, the 12 years of Reconstruction ended, white Southerners entered a period what they called redemption. They believed they were redeeming the South from black political power and Republican rule. They believed that they were saving white civilization. But this wasn't redemption. It was actually terrorism. So white supremacist groups, they would violently seize control of state governments. They forced the black people out of office and at gunpoint. And they passed these laws to disenfranchise black voters. They created poll taxes. They had some literary tests. They had property requirements. And then they had grandfather clauses, all of which was to prevent black people from voting. And so they instituted racial segregation in every aspect of life. And this is what came to be known as Jim Crow. So by 1900, most black men in the South could no longer vote. And in Louisiana, 130,000 black men were registered to vote in 1896. But by 1904, check this out. In Louisiana, 130,000 black men were registered to vote. That was in 1896. But just 8 years later, in 1904, only 1,342 people were registered. Black men were registered. So you went from 130,000 to 1,342. And so black politicians were driven out of office. Black landowners lost their property through violence, fraud, and legal manipulation. Black schools were defunded or burned. Everything Reconstruction built was systematically destroyed. And it would be nearly 90 years before the civil rights movement would challenge this system again. So what do we have here? Let's review where we've been as I bring this to a close. So in 1619, we had the first enslaved Africans arrive, technically America's true founding. In 1718, we had New Orleans founded and Code Noir enacted. Slavery infrastructure expands across the Deep South. 1700s to the 1850s, you had slavery. It became the foundation of the American economy. Then we discussed in 1857, we had the Dred Scott versus Sandford Supreme Court, and that ruling ruled that black people have no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So basically, they were saying that Sandford owned Scott. From 1861 to 1865, you had the Civil War, and approximately 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. In 1865, you had the 13th Amendment, slavery abolished except as punishment for a crime. From 1865 to 1870, you had that Reconstruction period where Black had political power and progress. Black people were able to vote, they were able to hold office, and they were able to build schools. But then in 1877, you had what you called the Compromise of 1877. So the federal troops were withdrawn and Reconstruction period ended. Then also in 1877, when Reconstruction ended, you then had that redemption period that white supremacists through violence took, well, I should say, they sought out to retake control. And that was when Jim Crow began. So before we talk about Jim Crow systematically, we need to talk about how it was enforced. So, what we're going to talk about we're going to talk about all of the massacres. So, be prepared. Always self care is always important. So, the next episode, I think I'm going to title it Terror and Resistance. We're going to talk about Colfax. We're going to talk about Wilmington. We're going to talk about Elaine, Tulsa, Rosewood, and Charleston. Yes, Charleston from 2015. Those are all massacres, and we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the pattern of violence that white supremacy used and still use today to crush black power. And then in the episode after that, we'll trace Jim Crow through mass incarceration all the way up to present day. So I do have this. That's the way I have it planned out right now. Anyways, I've had to already change a couple of episodes already. So that's what the outline looks like right now. Why does this matter? I know it's heavy. I know it's uncomfortable, but we have to understand the foundation before we can understand everything else, right? We have to understand that America was built on slavery, wealth, power, global dominance, all of it traces back to stolen labor, stolen land. Remember the 1619, remember 1718, remember 1857. Those years are important. Remember Scott v. Sandford case. Just remember everything. It's all going to come together. Okay? And for those of you who have been with me during this journey, during this Black History Month series, I appreciate your support. Do me a favor. Can you go ahead and comment, like, and subscribe? Share it with someone who needs to hear this. I believe everyone needs to hear this. I believe especially if you have children or have access to children, please sit them down, listen to these videos with them, these audio podcasts, I should say, and listen to it with them. They may have some questions. I encourage you. I'm just hitting the surface in these episodes, hoping that it triggers you to look further, look deeper, so that your eyes can see what's actually going on today. It started back in 1619, and we're in 2026, and some of these things are still going on. So I encourage you to dig deeper. Even what I've done as I've been researching and reading and writing and, the outline, making sure I cover some of the most important things. But there is so much more. And through this, I've actually planned to purchase another Black history book that from what I was reading, that's used in a lot of colleges. And I just want to see what they're teaching today. So with that, this is Monica with Cross to Cross Conversations. I thank you for listening.